So, a couple of days ago, I was watching a SpongeBob episode like a normal 23-year-old when I got an idea. Can I make a 3D version of SpongeBob Bikini Bottom Neighborhood only with Photoshop without using any 3D software? So, I turned on my rusty 10-year-old PC, fired up Photoshop, and let's say I had some technical issues.
Approximately 10 hours later.
With everything out of the way, I now decided to put my good old Photoshop skills into use. And since I was watching SpongeBob at the time, this is how I made SpongeBob Bikini Bottom Neighborhood in Photoshop.
Two weeks later.
Well, this step actually took way longer than I expected, but I think that's most of the images that I'm going to need for now. So I got this image that I'm going to use as a reference. While I'm not going to follow it exactly, but just to give me an idea where everything is supposed to go. Now it was time for the actual hard work. First of all, I started by working on the background. I placed the sand image first and I chose a couple of images that I was trying to combine to make the ocean in the background. At this point, I decided I'm not going for the fully realistic style, but instead I'll be trying to make a 3D version that looks similar to the original while still maintaining the cartoonish semi-realistic feel to it. Then I tried merging the images to make a simple bright blue ocean background without many details. I'm using levels to adjust the lighting to match it across all of them, and hue and saturation to match the color. I then added a bit of blue to the sands in the distance using curves. And now it was time to make the houses. I decided to mask each house from the reference image and placed it in position. This will make it much easier for me later on. Then I started working on the pineapple. I added some shadows using levels adjustment layer to make it more realistic. Made another layer for the cast shadow under the house. I'll be editing the colors and saturation later on once I finish the whole thing. Now I started working on the windows. This part took surprisingly a very long time. I really struggled to match the perspective of the windows to the pineapple shape. So I started by following the reference and made a circle for each layer of the window. I then used one layer for the metallic texture, another layer for the shadows, and another for the highlight. I also tried using bevel and emboss. It kind of worked for some parts, however it was really hard to match the light angle. I then added the nails, and I think this helped bring everything all together. And finally, it was time to move to the next step. With that out of the way, it was so much easier for me to make the other window. I followed the same steps, added some shadows to match the lighting of the house, then I moved to the door. I didn't follow the reference exactly for this one. I already had a couple of images that I was planning to use. I tried to match the lighting and the shadows and used some bevel and emboss for the borders, a metal texture for the door itself, and finally I gave it a bluish tone using curves. And I also added some blue tones to the windows as well to bring them more to life. Squidward's house was ironically the most fun to make, but it actually took the longest time. I followed a similar approach to the way I made the windows in SpongeBob's house, so I started out by planning the shape, tracing the reference image, and I added a texture layer for each shape along with some layers for the shadows and highlights. I used the stone texture and played around with the blending modes to see what worked best. And since I wasn't going for the most detailed version, just some simple shadows to define the overall structure will be enough. For the windows, it took me multiple tries until I had something that worked. I added some blue to the glass, then I added the door using a wooden texture that I found that looked kinda similar to the reference. And ironically though, Patrick's house was the easiest. I traced the shape with the pen tool, added some textures, but it looks so flat, so I added some shadows and highlights to give it some sort of a round shape. I used a couple of images of bamboo and merged them together to make the antenna on the roof, and finally with some shadows to match it with the rest of the scene. At this point, I think I finished most of the hard work. I added some shadows to Squidward's house, but looking at the reference again, I had to make the path that leads to each house. For SpongeBob and Patrick's houses, it was like a normal road, however SpongeBob's had water lilies on top. I used the pen tool to paint each path and a road image to give it some texture. I really tried my best to blend with the rest of the environment, however I'm still not fully satisfied with the way it looks, so I added some more shadows and painted around it with a mask to make it look like it's running through the sand. I did the same for Patrick's path as well. I used some wood steps for Squidward's path. I matched the perspective and used some level adjustment layer for the shadows. I used the same technique. I usually invert the mask and paint around the areas where I need the mask to appear. And now it was time to move to the final step, which is adding some details to the environment. I didn't like the way the sand looked. It was so soft compared to the original that had more texture to it. So I found another image that had a bit more texture, and I tried blending it and reducing the opacity, adding some seashells here and there, some rocks and plants in the background, and finally with some air bubbles that I really liked the way they looked. I added some light rays and spent around 30 minutes in camera raw filter because let's face it, I couldn't resist. I forgot to add the water lilies to SpongeBob's bath, so I did that and added some flowers to the background. And here's the result. Please do not forget to like the video and subscribe for more featured content, and I'll catch you in the next one.